Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 26 cheat sheet, and I'll be walking you through all the assets that I think are relevant, specifically on a week where a lot of people will be looking towards wildcarding. So I think the overall team structure is very important to highlight here. But for those who aren't wildcarding, of course, the priority is around Brighton and Brentford assets and which ones to prioritize specifically, because you probably won't have the wildcard template of 3x Brighton and 3x Brentford. So it's worth talking about what the priorities are. In my opinion, if we start with the midfielders, Mitoma and March are the priority assets to get from Brighton. Yes, of course, you can say Estupinian has been someone who's doing exceptional, but I would still prioritize these two players first, and then even McAllister as well as a close sort of second option if, let's say, March isn't ready to play, and if Estupinian, even if he's ready to play, I would still rate these attacking players, because I think Estupinian has been a little bit fortunate, I would say, to keep a clean sheet in one of the previous weeks, and simply put, this Brighton team are very chaotic. They do have very, very good expected goals conceded numbers, so that puts them towards the range of suggesting that they are a top 7 defense, but we haven't seen many clean sheets this season. That's sort of the style of play that they have. I would say Mitoma is also a tactical sort of question mark, because if Estupinian is playing on the left side, I think you can see Mitoma play a little bit more out wide, so he plays a bit more of a creative role, and you won't necessarily see him in touch with goal or playing like an inside forward. However, if Lamptey, for example, plays in the left back position, you could see Mitoma cut inside a little bit more, and that's going to be preferred as an FPL asset. I still think Mitoma looks fabulous. The underlying numbers are very, very close to March, and for that reason, I think both these assets are going to be close to essential. I would probably still prioritize going for Mitoma, just because we have some injury doubts in March. Maybe he will be eased in. And with McAllister, yes, of course, you have penalties, but there is a chance, of course, that he can play within the centre mid position, depending on the way that De Zerbi sets his team up. I don't think it's necessarily the case that McAllister will be playing as a 10 every game. So that's sort of what I have to say, and I think his stats are very much dependent on the position he plays, whereas with Mitoma and March, you have them as locks, playing as wingers and forwards. As far as 6.0 to 6.9 assets, Barnes for me is the interesting Leicester pick, because of course we got some news last week that Maddison had an injury. It seems like he will recover from this, and therefore a lot of people will be thinking about going for Maddison in the short term. However, Barnes has been a key asset to this Leicester team. I would still prioritize Iheanacho and Maddison over Barnes. And part of that is because I feel like Barnes has a lower ceiling as a player. He's less creative, so that actually allows him to get much less bonus points compared to someone like Maddison. Now, of course, there's a huge price gap between the two, so you have to think about, if you go for a player like Barnes, what sort of dividends can you get within the forward positions? What sort of dividends can you get in the defensive positions? Are there any upgrades that you'd like to go for that makes Barnes reasonable? Because you could actually go for a very, very cheap budget midfield setup, and that also allows you to, let's say, get some access with the money in the bank to going for players like Fernandes in Game Week 29 as an example. As far as Martinelli, he stays in that position because I'm expecting that Jesus will come back into this team. And whilst, of course, we had such an exceptional week, I have to say Odegaard for me is still preferred compared to Martinelli, because Odegaard will be nailed even when Jesus comes back to the team. And even if you think that Nketiah is completely out of this sort of 3-man attacking rotation, Martinelli still has to share 2 of the attacking positions with 2 other players. And for me, that still impacts Martinelli long term. We could see Jesus come back, and that will take away from some of the positions that Martinelli found himself in when he got so many of his goals in Game Week 25. And that's why I still think he has to be rated there. He's still going to be a great hold if you're an Arsenal owner. I don't think a side grade makes any sense whatsoever. But if I was wildcarding in, I actually think that Martinelli is someone that I'd probably avoid, because there could be a trap around him sooner than later. Now, if you're happy to go into Martinelli for, let's say, heading towards Game Week 29 and you're ready to bin him off at Game Week 29, then it's totally fine. It might make more sense, but I prefer to keep my assets thinking that they'll last in my team a little bit longer than expected, just in the worst case scenario, and that's kind of how I view Martinelli. Potentially you could see him as a yellow asset. As far as Odegaard and Rashford, I think we've talked about them plenty, so there's no reason to touch on that. Gakpo and Mahrez are very obvious drops because of the blank in Game Week 28, and simply because they're both rotation prone, because you're entering a phase in the season where both Liverpool and City have congested fixtures, but also just simply a lot of rotation. So whilst Liverpool seem to be impending with a kind of UCL exit, you've just got the reality that Gakpo will have to share minutes with Firmino and Jota, who are fit, and also Darwin, of course. As far as Mahrez, similar situation where with Foden finding some form, Pep finding a bit more confidence with Foden, you could see Foden playing a lot more of the Premier League games, and then Mahrez therefore being utilized in the Champions League. As far as 8.0 to 8.5 assets, I've risen Maddison, and I think he thoroughly deserves it as long as he's fit to play. The fixtures are fantastic. He's got 5 fixtures in 4 game weeks, and he's definitely an asset that I would love to target. And with Bowen, for me, he's still a pass because he still has his blank in game week 28, and ultimately the fixtures don't actually scream out as great because West Ham haven't posted great attacking numbers, and he's independently not that interesting, I would say, or that dominant in games. You could see, for example, in the Nottingham Forest performance that he was just part of the solution there. Of course, players like Ings, players like Benrahma had better games, and that's sort of the landscape. Whereas with Maddison, I think if Leicester are to get a good result, he's usually involved alongside Iheanacho, so you have a bit more of guarantees from someone like Maddison. As far as the 10 plus assets, potentially you could even argue that these players should not be targeted for the time being. There's just too few fixtures to think about, but both Salah and Fernandes have game week 29 doubles. Sterling himself does as well. I've removed Kevin De Bruyne from the cheat sheet. There just simply isn't a logical reason, in my opinion, that you should be keeping him in your teams. Sterling, of course, will be an interesting asset to think about. Whatever happens to Potter, I think he's looked good on paper, but I'm not ready to ride Sterling until we see a little bit better performances from this Chelsea team, because he's still too expensive to actually own when you have all these other great assets that have plenty of fixtures as well and are cheaper. And even when you look at the forwards, for example, a similar sort of landscape there, Sterling is still someone that I'm not ready to sort of jump the gun on, but I'm ready to include him into the cheat sheet. Fernandes, for me, is a fantastic lock for game week 29. Whatever way you go towards Fernandes there, I think you should find one, even if it means dropping Erling Haaland. And for me, he will be an asset to think about then. And if you're carrying him all this way towards game week 29, it makes sense too, because ultimately, if you're, let's say, free hitting on 28 and you're not wildcarding on 26, you still have this Southampton fixture to capitalize on, and Fernandes has looked a lot better. The underlying stats are starting to tickle up, and that's going to be a great situation to be as a Fernandes owner as you head towards game week 29, which could be explosive. As far as the forwards, if we move towards there, I've added a lot of changes towards the forwards, and I have to say that the first thing is to talk about the triple asterisk situation. And now with Tony, the impending news, or at least the news that we got so far, is that he will have a sort of trial hearing in April, which means he should be allowed to play heading towards game week 29, which is a great fixture run to own Tony over. However, if we get any sort of news that Tony might not be able to play, specifically with Thomas Frank and his interviews, then we should probably think about Wissa as options. And then, of course, Mbeumo for me is locked because he's someone who is nailed in this Brentford team, potentially has less minutes because he is usually frequently subbed out, 10 to 20 minutes left within the game, and he's less explosive as Tony. Also doesn't get penalties when Tony's playing. So he's an asset to think about simply because he's at a great price point, has a lot of fixtures, and probably will cover you quite well over this period. Very similar to someone like Solanke, but he has an additional fixture. As far as Ferguson, he's been added towards the cheat sheet here. I think the reality is I prefer Brighton assets like Enes Stupinian over Ferguson, because with Ferguson, he still has to be eased in after his recent injury. Potentially, you could say that the minutes will continue to fly and he could be close to a 90-minute man. But we have seen very frequently that players like Welbeck will come in. They also have a little bit more rotation pieces that De Zerbi has made available. So even if Ferguson has good games and he has great underlying stats compared to March and Matoma, I do think there's a genuine question mark around how often he's actually going to get more than 80 minutes a game, and that's going to be why I probably would sidestep him, and simply because we have so many great forward options compared to the midfield at this point in time on this game week 26 trajectory. I think Ferguson is probably one that I would avoid. But if you are someone who's looking to go for a differential path, I think he's a fantastic player. A lot of people do project him to be a great asset and a great player ultimately going forwards, and I think he's already shown quite a bit of it, and the underlying numbers do support it. So it's more of a case that Ferguson is great if you want to go a little bit outside the template. As far as Iheanacho, I think he could be one that you could embrace already, because if you are someone who's ambitious and you don't want to go for Kane, you don't want to go for Haaland, you want to embrace the fact that people have more fixtures between 26 and 29, then Iheanacho is going to be one of those assets very similar to Watkins further down this list, where you want to think about them already. Ultimately, this sort of run of fixtures, with Chelsea also losing Thiago Silva, is a very good run of fixtures for Iheanacho. He might not get as many minutes as some of the other forwards in this list, with exception to Ferguson, but he's been explosive as of late, and we know he's been quintessential to the way that Leicester actually build up their attacks. He's a great target man, a forward who's incredibly dynamic, and I think has a very large skill set. And we are seeing that Brendan Rodgers is backing him. So we could see the return of course, what was a great run 2 years ago when we owned Iheanacho near the end of the season. So hopefully he can repeat that. And I think this is the fixture run to kind of think about whether you'd like to embrace an asset like that. And if someone like Tony, for example, was taken out of, let's say, our potential options, then Iheanacho could be someone that I would probably have a little bit more faith in than a Brentford forward. As far as Solanke, he's someone to just simply think about as a Game Week 28 transfer, because if you were, let's say, to move out of Tony, or sorry, rather Game Week 29, if you were to move out of Tony or to move out of Haaland, then he's a great make weight transfer. Specifically, if you, let's say, own the sort of pair up between Kane and Haaland, you could quite easily go to Solanke for a bit, then move out of Kane into Haaland around that sort of run of Game Week 30 and beyond. So I like Solanke in terms of how he papers over the cracks, and also has ultimately a very good for Game Week 29. But of course, this Bournemouth team aren't exceptional. You're just looking towards him being a sort of bench boost piece for you, and a make weight, so that, let's say, someone like March or Matoma, who's much cheaper, can be transferred into someone like a Fernandes if you prefer the fixture of United and you want to make way for some of the assets that aren't Arsenal assets. As far as Nketiah, though, he has to drop, and potentially he should be a complete avoid at this point in time. Maybe that was a mistake from me. Of course, seeing him being benched 2 games in a row doesn't really seem to be injury related, because we can see it. Nketiah comes in what I would like to call garbage time for Arsenal now, when they're actually winning convincingly with 20 to 30 minutes remaining, and with Jesus coming back, I mean, that's going to be slimming down the amount of minutes he gets, because Jesus is close to a 90-minute player as far as the last time we saw him. And even though he's going to be building up minutes, you still have a competition with Trossard and Martinelli, so just really not worth thinking about as an asset. As far as Johnson, still just Nottingham Forest is not a team that I'm super confident in. I think he's been great for the team, but ultimately the strength of the team is very important, and it contributes to how a striker or a forward in FPL is going to do well. So for me, Johnson is one to avoid, in the same Mitrovic, who simply has a blank in Game Week 28, thanks to the overperformance, I would say, versus Leeds in the FA Cup. As far as 7.0 to 7.9 assets, no changes here. Potentially Havertz is considerably an avoid. However, I think Felix and Watkins are both great options. You have to sort of expect that the Chelsea team will do well over this run of fixtures. And as far as Watkins, he's already performing well and is on penalties, so there's nothing really more to add to these two assets. Darwin gets a drop. I think he's still an explosive player. I think a lot of people do see him as a poor option, simply because he's now quite expensive compared to some of these other forwards who just have much more fixtures. And you could see him arguably as an orange tier asset, but he still has a double in Game Week 29. And I think if you're looking at Liverpool assets, right, in these tough fixtures versus City and Chelsea, he is someone that I would expect to do well in such fixtures, because he is such a sort of fixture-proof player in the way he plays. I think it's so hard to defend him. You could see the way he scored early on in the season when Liverpool were playing Man City in the Community Shield as a good example of that. Haaland and Kane, these players are fantastic. Kane actually no longer has a Game Week 28 blank, and a lot of people are thinking about dropping Haaland the wild card, but I'm not there yet. I don't think he must be dropped on the wild card. I think that's ludicrous to say. I think you should probably plan around playing Haaland Game Weeks 26, 27 at the very minimum first to capitalize on that, because he is explosive and fixture proof, and you could probably just transfer it to someone like Watkins in Game Week 28 when he gets to play Everton again. So that's going to be a good example there. You also have some other great options like a João Felix, of course, who could be played in that sort of fixture. And yeah, that's sort of my opinion. As far as Kane, I think he's actually started to become a better asset than Haaland just on this sort of timeline. So if you're thinking about wildcarding now, I think the priority would go towards Kane first for me before I talk about Haaland or think about adding Haaland into my team. This is the time to think about going for assets that are swords. And for me, Kane is a bit more of a sword, just simply because he has more fixtures than Haaland. And we've seen that Kane has been incredibly fixture-proof as well himself. Of course, potentially not hitting the same sort of highs or ceilings as Haaland. As far as the defenders this week, we are now moving towards a landscape where I think clearly double Newcastle is back on the menu. I've already preemptively moved some of the Newcastle assets towards the yellow tier, and you could obviously include Schär within this list as well. I think he's someone that I probably may have omitted. However, I think the reality is you probably want to be going with Trippier than one of Botman and Burn, just so that your team is actually well spaced out in terms of cash. I prefer Trippier much more than Schär, and I think Schär, despite being more expensive than Botman and Burn, despite having better expected goal involvement numbers, the gulf between Trippier and all these other assets, including Schär, is huge. So I see it as better to sort of save money and just go for Botman and Burn. As far as Duncan and Estupiñán, these two assets have risen towards the absolute top, and the reality is Brighton have some absolutely great fixtures. As I talked about previously, I think Estupiñán, of course, is the priority asset to go for, but if we get any wind of news that he's not ready to play, then I think you could start with Dunk in Game Week 26 and you wouldn't lose too much out compared to Estupiñán. However, I think if Estupiñán is out, you might actually think about going for Sanchez as your keeper, because it might also help you when it comes to fielding out a Game Week 28 team and getting that additional player. However, going for both me and Pinnock doesn't seem to be that interesting to me. Up to you on what you want to do around that. You could obviously think about maybe just going for double Brentford and simply just going for a double Newcastle backline as well, because that would suit quite well. You do miss out on that one fixture when it comes to Everton and Southampton, but in reality, I think those two away fixtures are so good on paper for clean sheets for Brentford, even though a lot of people have been talking about how these fixtures are away and their away form is worse. You still have to look at the underlying stats of their away fixtures and their form so far, and the reality is Brentford are still a sort of top 8 underlying defense, so we don't need to get too far ahead of ourselves, but it still makes sense to me to capitalize on me and Pinnock if you want to sort of go for a Sanchez keeper variation. Now, when we're talking about someone like Ben White, I still think he's actually towards the top. Arsenal simply have such great fixture probabilities and sort of dividends when it comes to these game weeks. You can see the last game week and the doubles there as good examples of that. All the Arsenal defenders, whenever they're winning a game like 1-0 or 2-0, still have great chances of getting bonus, and simply put, they're one of the best defenses in the league. You do miss out on one fixture compared to Newcastle, who are arguably a better defense. However, with Arsenal players, I think the reality is you can still fit one of them in your team because they're still incredibly cheap, and therefore Ben White still remains as a great option. Emerson is someone that I've added to the cheat sheet. You could obviously think about some of the other Tottenham rotation options if you think Emerson is prone to being rotated with Pedro Porro. You have Davies, of course, you have Dyer, who are probably more fixture proof, but what is the ceiling of those players? I'm not entirely sure. As far as Mings, he's also someone who's very good at papering over the cracks, so I think he's not necessarily a priority transfer because he plays for a much worse defense compared to some of the players from the Newcastle teams. He doesn't have the same attacking edge as someone like Reece James lower down in the sort of premium tier, and ultimately, of course, I don't rate him nearly as much as, let's say, Arsenal. If you compare, for example, Arsenal's 4-game fixture run compared to Aston Villa's 5-game fixture run, I'd still probably back Arsenal to get maybe double the clean sheets or double the points really as it pans out. So that's sort of how I still view Mings. I think he's a great asset to think about, but not necessarily someone that I would think about prioritizing. I think Watkins is the only Aston Villa asset that I would consider first and foremost. As far as Gabriel Saliba, same sort of logic there. Zinchenko, of course, a top asset as well. What's interesting about Gabriel Saliba is previously we would have thought that they were more nailed than Zinchenko, but I think we have entered the stage of the season where Arteta clearly sees Zinchenko as an incredible pivot in the system, and you can see that Tierney doesn't hold a candle to him at all. I think Tierney will be used within all the Europa League games. Zinchenko will be rested in the last 10 minutes of the game, but that's not really a problem because that usually suggests that Arsenal are probably holding a clean sheet. Bring in Tomiyasu just to sort of bolster the result and to sort of lock it down in the last 10 minutes. I don't see Zinchenko as being someone who, like Ben White, dangerously entered that sort of 59-minute sub territory. Zinchenko is someone who I can clearly see playing at least 80 minutes per game. So that's sort of how I view Zinchenko for now. As far as Badiashile, he's starting to be an interesting option because, of course, Thiago Silva's out. But what is the attacking upside for a Chelsea team that still don't seem like that they have their gears going? I think you have to sort of take a chance and go for James instead. And if you have Kepa already, you don't really want to go for a very low ceiling double defense when you have or when you're passing up even options from this Newcastle team. As far as Shaw, he still remains in that sort of position. I think ultimately Southampton's a great fixture. It seems like he might be an injury doubt for Game Week 26, but he's a great asset. And by Game Week 29, I'm sure that we'll all find a way to put Shaw back into our teams. He's more interesting than both Dalot and Wan-Bissaka due to the rotation there, and yeah, I think it's just purely based on his injury doubt and also the blank game week fixtures plus the Liverpool game where I think Liverpool could quite easily score in Anfield. And yeah, I think Shaw's a great asset in 29, just one to think about later. As far as James and Trippier, these are two assets that have risen towards the top, and with Trent, I think simply because the game week 29 fixture is so bad from a clean sheets perspective, the same thing with game week 26, I just can't see the value of him when you top it all off with the game week 28 blank. As far as the keepers this week, just to round things off, because I haven't talked about keepers for a while, I think simply put, keepers have been very boring to talk about, so there's been no reason to really talk about them. However, you do have a great wildcard windows. So of course people will want to hear me talk about keepers. I think Raya and Sanchez are within the same tier. Simply put, Raya is probably the best pairing, I would say, with Kepa. I've heard talk about Sanchez and Kepa being a great rotation pair, but I think if you're also planning to, let's say, save the free hit or be flexible with Game Week 32, Game Week 32 is a very glaring bad fixture for the Kepa Sanchez rotation. The only benefit to going for Sanchez really is how it might actually give you an additional player in Game Week 28 when you have that blank game week there for Sanchez, where Kepa can just deputize in that week. And then with Raya, you don't get any additional value from that, and it probably means, of course, that your outfield team will have one less player compared to the Sanchez variation. However, I think Raya, when you also look at how he's actually gotten points this season, has been incredible for bonus. I think there has to be something said about the consistency there. Both the expected goals conceded for Brighton and Brentford are very, very good. They do situate themselves as within the top half of the table, and they have so many fixtures where I think it's just worth it considering players like Raya and actually playing them. Even playing Raya, let's say, ahead of Kepa, if we don't seem to see that this Chelsea team is performing well. As far as Ramsdale and Pope, simply secondary options. I don't really think I would go there. Ultimately, there's a lot more fixtures to be played with cheaper goalkeepers, so just why not play around with that instead? And that's going to be the cheat sheet this week. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead.